a couple of people in just a few minutes. We're fortunate to have our guests who are with the East Foundation. They probably know more about the truth of what's happening in this than I'll put them up against anybody. Now, I am a little biased. I've had an opportunity for over 10 years to work with the East Foundation, and I know them very well. I'm going to spare you hearing me read their bios. Both of them are PhDs, and that's always scary. Hope I'm not insulting anybody in the room, but I do want you to know that yes, they are smart, but probably the most important thing is they're really outstanding people. The East Foundation is a nonprofit like the San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo. We both, while we do some things differently, we both support education and education of the youth in this great state of ours. So we're glad to have somebody with us that can shoot straight with us and share some knowledge. Our two speakers are going to be Neil Wilkins, who is the president and CEO, and Jason Sawyer, the chief science officer, who is also a major part of the executive management of East Foundation. So with that, I'll stop talking and let us get started with Neil Wilkins. Please help me welcome him.
Thank you, Dick. Really appreciate all of you being here. Appreciate your interest in this issue. A little bit about East Foundation. We operate on ranch lands in Deep South Texas. We're down in Starr County, Jim Hogg County, Willacy County, and Kennedy County. We operate over a little over 217,000 acres of private ranch land. We've got our own cattle operation, but we also do research on the cattle-wildlife interface. We have education programs, so if you were to look through Deep South Texas, some of the major education on bringing kids out to ranches, that's one of the things that our education team does. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about New World screwworms. One of the reasons that we got interested in this issue almost 2 years ago, we began to notice in the background, while everything else is going on in the world, that New World screwworms snuck beyond the Darien Gap in Panama and began to go through Central America for the first time in several decades. And looking at how prepared the United States was for that, which was woefully unprepared, we began to put two and two together, and then lo and behold, about almost exactly a year ago, we ended up with screwworms coming into Mexico. And so what we want to talk about today is kind of twofold. It's really important that we know the history of this issue, because the history is prologue for how we handle the issue here in the United States, were we to get screwworms. Now, we talk in our office quite a lot because we put so much effort into this issue that we're going to be in one of two camps 2 or 3 years from now. Either screwworms don't make it into the United States and we feel kind of foolish for spending all this effort on screwworms, or they do make it into the United States and we're glad we prepared. We want to be in that first category. We'd rather feel foolish and be prepared than end up with screwworms. So here's a little bit about this critter we're talking about. I'm not going to go through the life cycle or anything like that. You can find that information in a lot of places. Some of you in here might remember the last time screwworms that were in the United States in the late 70s was the last time that we had screwworm incursions up through Texas. We'll talk about that, a little bit of the history there. Bottom line was, it was not a happy time for livestock producers. It was not a good time for our wildlife populations throughout the state. And in fact, it took several decades for our deer population to rebound after some heavy screwworm infestations in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So here's this critter right here, the screwworm fly, and there's the maggot. I won't do like you see in a lot of places, a lot of gruesome pictures of infestations and this type of stuff. We're just going to get down into the details. One of the things you could have picked up in the back there, if you did, that's fine. If you didn't, you can pick it up later, but this is just one page, and on the front of this page is this map that you see on the slide here, and then on the back is a timeline, and I'll refer to that timeline over and over as we go through here. If you don't have that in front of you, no harm, no foul. If you do have it, you can refer to it, you can keep it, you can put notes on it, that type of stuff. So here's just a bottom line thumbnail sketch of what has happened over the last couple of years. So you can see in August of 2022, screwworms breached the Darien Gap. So they are all the way throughout South America. Traditionally, they've been throughout much of Central America, much of Mexico, and a large part of North America. They're endemic, which means that they're native. They were originally here. In August of 22, they breached the Darien Gap, and then 22 months later, they had gone 1,100 miles through Central America, and at that time, there were a little over 47,000 cases of screwworms throughout Central America. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about why that explosion through Central America. 7 months later, they had gone another 300 miles, and there were 2,177 cases throughout 6 Mexican states. This was after almost exactly a year ago, so right at the front end of November, 3 screwworm cases in southern Mexico. So they passed from Central America into Mexico. 1 month later, they had made it another 225 miles, and there were a little over 3,800 cases throughout 6 Mexican states. So you could see they were traveling pretty quick. So that infestation and the movement of livestock from Central America up into Mexico had a large part to do with the incursion. It wasn't just flies flying through Mexico. It was illegal livestock movements through Central America and into Mexico, and then transport of livestock that was largely responsible for those movements. In July of 25, the screwworms were found 375 miles from the U.S. border in Veracruz. And then by August, we had a little over 4,500 cases. They'd gone another 300 miles in that 2-month period. And then in September, so last month, 70 miles from the border, there was a case in Sabinas Hidalgo, which is in Nuevo Leon, which is about 98 miles from the southern border of our San Antonio Viejo ranch. So that's how it hits home to us and why we get so intensely interested in this issue and have tried to gather together information, work in partnership with our state agencies like Texas Animal Health Commission, and then try to make some track record with USDA to make some progress. Okay. I'm gonna go pretty fast through most of this. My partner, Jason Sawyer, is going to tell you a little bit more practical stuff on what we can do about it. I'm going to give you the history, why we need to be concerned about it from the overall perspective. He's going to go into here's what you can do on your operation. So Mexico's been divided up into basically 3 areas, and that area in the pink is that area that's infested. And it will take, if history is prologue, it will take somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 years with enough sterile screwworm flies released, and we'll talk about that in a minute, to move them back down south of the Darien Gap. So this is going to be an issue for quite some time. The yellow area, or the mustard color there, is a buffer area. There are screwworm incursions up into that buffer area, and with the exception of 2 cases in that green area, now this is all in Spanish because unfortunately this is where you get most of the information is off Mexican websites right now. Here's that same map with the accumulated cases on it. So these are as of October 18th, which October 18th, I think that's last week maybe. So there's 8,632 accumulated cases throughout Mexico. About 6,500 of those are in cattle, 53 human cases of New World screwworms, and then, you know, a wide variety of other warm-blooded mammals and birds that have been documented in these accumulated cases. Now, these are accumulated cases that are reported by Mexico. They're not doing any surveillance in wildlife. They might not be reporting all of their cases, but these are the cases that are reported by the Mexican government. Now, those accumulated cases are different than the active cases, and this is pretty important. So you notice back in the accumulated cases, we've got some of those purple colored dots. You can see that one up near Nuevo Leon, and then another one a little bit further south up in the northern part of Mexico. Those are some of the accumulated cases. Some of those have been resolved since then, and resolved could include several things. Either there's documentation that there's no other screwworms or screwworm flies associated with that location, and or the animals died, and or they've simply resolved the case with those animals. So a great deal of the cases in Mexico have been resolved, but we continue to have week over week, double-digit percentage increases in accumulated cases. So here's the active cases. So active cases in Mexico as of this last week, a little over 419 cattle. The second most affected active case right now is in dogs. So, 115 or 114 dog cases, and then, swine, goats, cats, parakeets, these types of things. So, but most of that is in the southern part of Mexico. In fact, 71% of these active cases are in Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Veracruz. So it's a big concentration there. We're going to talk about the dispersal of screwworm flies here in a minute. That dispersal of screwworm flies are basically trying to maintain that boundary to keep them south of an area that is basically that green line where you see the yellow coming down, that green line in southern Mexico. Through dispersal of sterile flies, they're trying to keep it below that point. So the U.S. border is closed now. We've closed the U.S. border 3 times. So here's a little bit of the history of how that happened. So in November of 24, a year ago, when those 3 cases came into Mexico, USDA closed the border, so no Mexican cattle imported into the United States. In February, the import ban was lifted, and we had inspection protocols that USDA had worked out with Mexico. 2 months later, those eradication efforts were strained. Whether Mexico was complying with those inspection protocols or not, you can hear several stories, but nevertheless, they weren't successful. There was an agreement to go for full eradication out of Mexico. That did not work, and so on May 11th, the border was closed again. Then in June, we made an agreement with Mexico to reopen the border in a phased reopening starting June 7th. So there was a gradual reopening of the border, started June 7th. The very next day, in fact, the very next morning, a new screwworm case was discovered in Veracruz, so 370 miles from the border. So then the very next day, so we opened it up on the 7th. We found screwworms on the 8th, and we closed it on the 9th. So that was a pretty short border opening, right? And so it's been closed ever since. So this says as of October 18th. As of today, the U.S. border is closed to Mexican imports of cattle. So I'm going to shift and go through the timeline. And this timeline is pretty important. So we kind of went through the recent timeline, what's happened in the past 2 years, how come we've got this resurgence into the United States. What I'd like to do now is kind of go through a little bit of the ancient history, because it has a lot to do with why we are taking the strategy that we're taking in the United States with the help of our industry associates and our state and federal agencies. You'll see this timeline on the back here. You can follow along there. We'll start with real ancient history, just because I like this picture. Here's the guy that first discovered screwworms. I'm not sure how to say his last name. Charles, let's say it's Coquerel. He's a French naval surgeon and entomologist, and he found them in the Antilles, so that would have been Cuba or Haiti, around through there. Then things were pretty quiet on the screwworm front for a few years after he discovered them, but they were definitely known by the Native Americans. They were definitely known by the early settlers, and they were definitely a problem during that period. They were recognized as a major pest in the early 1900s. In 1933, there was a devastating outbreak in Texas, and so that became the modern era of New World screwworms, was in 1933. There was a key biological discovery by two guys from Menard, Texas. Raymond Bushland and Edward Nippling had this theory. So they were entomologists, and they started, like entomologists will do, they started looking at the sex life of the screwworm. And they figured out that the females only mated once, and the males were promiscuous. So they had this harebrained scheme that if they could release a bunch of sterile male flies that would mate with all those females, that those females would lay infertile eggs, and in a few generations we wouldn't have screwworms anymore. It was a great idea. The only problem was, at the time, they had no way to raise screwworms, and they had no way to make them sterile. So then World War II came along. So they developed some mass rearing techniques. One of them, I think Raymond Bushland went off on his own and developed these mass rearing techniques, so they could, which was a nasty situation because you're raising them basically in rotting animal flesh, raising screwworm flies. And while his partner was off in some other places during World War II, they got back together in 1950 and had a breakthrough and figured out how to sterilize the flies. And so they pioneered this sterile insect technique. There's a station close by here in Kerrville. It's the Bushland Nippling Station. You can see it at that first exit as you drive on I-10 in Kerrville. Look off up to your right, and they're reconstructing that station there. But for the entirety of this time, since the 1940s, that station has continued to work on screwworms real quietly. Now everybody knows about them. They thought that they were working on something we'd never have to mess with again. So if you get a chance to go by that station, go take a look. These guys won an award that was equivalent to the Nobel Peace Prize, and we'll talk about that later, but it was considered the 20th century's most original idea. If you can imagine how much they must have been made fun of to come up with this crazy scheme. They had this breakthrough. They went and got a cobalt-60 gamma radiation reactor, and the protocols for that weren't as heavy as they are now. So I can imagine Bushland and Nippling driving to Oak Ridge, Tennessee in a pickup truck, maybe picking up this nuclear reactor and hauling it back to Kerrville. I don't know if that's what happened, but I like to think that's what happened. And then they were able to use their mass rearing techniques. They kept at it. So think about it. They've kept at it for 15 or 20 years at that point. They figured out the mass rearing techniques. They figured out how to sterilize these flies. They had the first mass eradication efforts in the 1950s. And then all this time we had big infestations of screwworms in the United States. They put on an eradication campaign in Florida and the Southeast first between 1957 and 1959, actually eradicated them from the southeastern U.S. and Florida by 1959. And then They couldn't figure out how to afford this, to do this in Texas in the southwestern U.S., so up steps this guy by the name of Dolph Briscoe. And Dolph Briscoe in 1960 wasn't governor by then. He was the president of Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association. This is my favorite picture of Dolph Briscoe. He's there on the left. That's is that Sid Richardson that's next to him? I believe it is. And anyway, he led fundraising for screwworm eradication and gathered together the equivalent of $31 million in 1960 money to start eradication efforts in Texas. We expanded eradication efforts and had official eradication in about 1966. Now, we had incursions later. They built 2 screwworm facilities to rear these sterile flies, one in Mission, Texas, and one off in Florida. These historic facilities also, we had, later we had one down in Panama, and then another one up in Chiapas. But we'll talk about those in a minute. So many of you will recall at least the stories, and the people that fought screwworms during that period used a lot of different pesticides, a lot of different treatments, a lot of stuff that really wasn't very good for us. But they were successful. They learned how to treat these animals. They had a whole lot more horses, a whole lot more people with hands in the field, but it was still devastating. And they contributed to the eradication effort. And so officially by 1966, and so think about it, it took 4 years to go through with sterile screwworm flies, producing somewhere between 500 million and 600 million sterile screwworm flies per week. Per week is what it took to release them across the southwestern United States to drive screwworms south of our border. But then you can look at what it took to get them all the way down to the Darien Gap, down through Mexico. Once we got to the U.S. border, it took 34 years to drive them south with the same numbers of sterile screwworm flies, drive them south through Mexico, south through Central America, and finally to eradicate them south of the Darien Gap in Panama, and then a facility was built in Panama. So everything in red in the Americas still has screwworms. The only green little island there in South America is Paraguay, and there's no screwworms reported from Chile. So you see that along the map there. So as we mentioned, eradication took 34 years from the U.S. border south. If we look at where they've gone just in the last 3 years, in what the screwworms have gained in the last 3 years, it will take 18 years if we drive them back at the same rate. So if we stop the progression of screwworms where they are, history shows that it took 18 years to drive them back to Panama at that point. And that's when they had lots of sterile screwworm flies to release. In 1977, we created an agreement with Mexico. It was called COMEXA. We built a sterile fly production facility in Chiapas. It produced 300 to 350 million flies per week, and that's what was used to help drive them south out of Mexico. We're going to talk here in a little bit what happened to that facility. That facility was owned by the United States. USDA owned that facility. It was our tax money that paid for that facility, paid for the development of it, and the annual operation. And we're going to talk about that, what happened here in a minute. The last endemic cases in Texas were in the 1980s. And so the facility that was producing sterile flies for release in Mission was then closed because we didn't have them in Texas anymore. And we thought, okay, we've gotten rid of them forever and ever, right? I can't remember the year. In the 1980s, we were operating heavily that facility in Tuxtla Gutiérrez, which is in Chiapas. That facility was in 2012, and there was a decision by Secretary of Agriculture and the administration to give that facility to Mexico. So we gave it to Mexico. It was immediately closed, and it was used by the Mexican military for a while, and not sure what the fate of that facility is now. There was some incursions back into Texas, even in the 1970s. So here's the incursions back into Texas in 1972. Some of you might have remembered that. Infestation went all the way up through Oklahoma. There was an official eradication in 1991 in Mexico, so Mexico hasn't seen screwworms since 1991. Nippling and Bushland were then awarded that prize, and it just said, hey, it's the best idea anybody's had in the 20th century, or the most original idea. And then we established COPEG, so it was an agreement between the United States and Panama, and COPEG agreement remains intact. And then there was an initial launch of the only existing sterile screwworm facility in Pecora, Panama. Now that facility only produces 100 million flies per week. Now, if you recall the numbers that were needed in order to drive screwworms south from the southwestern United States, Florida and the southeast, took 34 years, and it took somewhere between 500 and 700 flies per week in release. Right now, available to us, and they're available to us, those are our flies, those are the United States flies in Panama, but they're in Panama, right? So available to us are 100 million flies per week, and we can't shut that facility down in order to expand it. We've got to just continue to do what we can with those 100 million flies until we can figure something else out. COMEXA ended in 2012, like we talked about, and that facility was given back to Mexico. Immediately, we regretted that because there was a localized outbreak in Florida. So in 2016, there was an outbreak in the Florida Keys. It decimated the Florida key deer, which is an endangered white-tailed deer in Florida, and it took a large percentage of that population. So here's where we are now with the closed down facilities in Florida and Texas and in Chiapas, with the only existing facility with that arrow showing there in Pecora, Panama. But here's future facilities. So USDA has paid Mexico to develop a new facility that's under development, which is the refurbishment of a fruit fly facility in Matapa, Chiapas. So that's down there in that southern part of Mexico. Upon opening, which will be later in 2026 perhaps, there'll be another 100 million flies per week perhaps would come out of that facility. And then there's a new facility planned in the United States. Now, this was a hard-fought battle to get a new facility planned in the United States. You may have seen the news about this over the last several months. Secretary Brooke Rollins, who's from Texas, announced that she's dedicating $850 million to fight screwworms in Texas and the southern United States, $750 million of which goes to the development of a brand new facility in Mission, so the same general area where that facility was before. By the way, Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, sitting at the table right over here, had a major part in influencing the Secretary of Agriculture in doing that. TSCRA put together a coalition of 13 organizations here in Texas. East Foundation's part of that group. So basically it's TSCRA, Cattle Feeders, Texas Sheep and Goat Raisers Association, Texas Wildlife Association, and they organized a national campaign out of an office in Fort Worth, a national campaign to influence Congress and to influence the Secretary of Agriculture, and she ultimately took it and got the thumbs up from President Trump to dedicate the funds for constructing that facility in Texas. So we're not just at the whims of the government there. There's opportunities through organizations like TSCRA, and they'll take membership applications over there. So you're welcome. So last week, actually it was a week ago Friday, USDA finally made good on their promise to release their plans for how screwworms will be handled in the United States. This is called a response playbook. Right now it's in draft format. Secretary Rollins released it at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon 2 Fridays ago. The Texas Animal Health Commission, along with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and the Industry Coalition, is working back and forth with USDA right now to make this playbook practical. I'm going to review with you. Now, keep in mind, this wasn't my idea. I'm going to review with you what's in the playbook as far as containment protocols and quarantines. And I'll just give you a thumbnail sketch of it. So here's their sketch in the response playbook for what happens when a New World screwworm, either a worm in an animal, is documented and that presumptive case becomes a confirmed positive case, or whether we catch a fly. So that point will have a 20-kilometer, and they continue to use kilometers in this book, even though we're in the United States, a 20-kilometer radius around that point, and then it will be moved out to landmarks. So that 20-kilometer radius is about 12.4 miles. A 12.4-mile radius around any one point, no matter what country you're in, is about 310,000 acres. So there will be a containment zone around that 20,000 acres. Now, luckily, it's not the USDA that will be managing that containment zone. It will be the Texas Animal Health Commission. And Texas Animal Health Commission will then, if you have a premise number, an individual animal ID, they will in short order be able to come in, give individual animal inspections and certificates for movement of those animals out of that quarantine zone. There'll be another 20-kilometer area around that quarantine zone. So let's take the minimum size, 20 kilometers plus another 20 kilometers. If you do the pi r squared and figure out the area of that, that's a little over 3 million acres, 3.1 million acres in that secondary zone right there. So it's a pretty large area, right? That's twice the size of Travis County, a little more than Bexar County. And then there will be a surveillance area, so where increased attention will be put on surveillance, and it'll be a fly surveillance area of up to 200 kilometers around that point. Now, let's pretend it's exactly 200 kilometers. If you do the math there, you end up with over 30 million acres inside that 200-kilometer radius. For perspective, 30 million acres is 18% the size of the entire state of Texas. So we could tie up, in one way or another, something in the neighborhood of 18% of the entire state of Texas with one fly. So now the industry is working along with Texas Animal Health Commission and Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to figure out the details, because it's only a week old, right? To figure out the details of how this will operate. There's a lot of people working on it. I would encourage you to go look at it and read it, figure it out for yourself. I mean, everybody in here is smart, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a heavy-duty entomologist to figure it out. So mitigating the impact. We're going to talk about some of the other ways we can mitigate here in just a minute, but it's strong surveillance, early detection, rapid response, containment. Hopefully, that containment also includes the distribution of sterile flies and shipping sterile flies up storing them in Mission at what will be an intermediate facility is going to be a reality here pretty soon. And then what few sterile flies we have will be, logically and hopefully precision applied to those areas. We'll talk about preventive treatments, animal husbandry, and then maybe even some of the innovations that are out there. Some of the agencies involved: Texas Animal Health Commission. They might have personnel in the room here. We may call upon them here in a minute if we can't answer any technical questions. Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Some of these other agencies: Texas Department of Agriculture has a role, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. You'll hear them just in shorthand called APHIS. That's what that is. That's USDA. The station, the Nippling Bushland Station near Kerrville, is part of USDA ARS. You'll hear them just talked about as the research station at sometimes. And then all of the associations involved. So if you're interested and really want to get into all the information, our Screwworm Coalition cooperates on just a centralized web page. I mean, our people contribute to that. TSCRA and the coalition there runs that web page, and that's screwwormtx.org. There's a URL code up there if you want to look at some of the other resources we've got on an East Foundation page, but I'd encourage you to take a look at that. And all of the stuff that I've told you about in one way or the other is represented on those web pages. So I think we're going to wait till both Jason and I are done to take questions, and we'll just kind of take questions in rapid fire there. But Jason Sawyer.
All right. Thank you, Neil. Y'all bear with me just 1 second. We'll get this fired back up. Perfect. Screens went blank. We're done. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'll give those just a second to get fired back up. As was stated earlier, my name is Jason Sawyer. I'm also with the East Foundation, and now that Neil's had the opportunity to kind of talk us all through the history and kind of the state of play where things are today from a broad perspective, what I'd like to do is spend the next little bit with you talking about kind of what we're doing. And this is really from our perspective as an operator. So we're, of course, interested in sort of the larger public issue and the public response and how it threatens our industries and the economy of our state. But we're also facing this in the same way that you might be. What do we do about this problem? Should it involve itself in our ranching operations and in our wildlife programs? And so that's kind of the gear shift that we're going to make here for the next few minutes. As we've talked about, we ranch in deep South Texas. This image here is just to kind of show you where our operational footprint is. And the main thing I want you to notice about that is that big pink blob you see kind of furthest to the west there. If we went in a straight line from there, it's about 24 miles from our front gate to the river. If we kept going on that line for about another 65 miles, we would be in Sabinas Hidalgo, which is the location that Neil mentioned where there was a screwworm, an infested animal with screwworm larvae here just a couple of weeks ago. If you look down kind of on the coast over there, that pink splotch that you see furthest south on the coast, that's basically the north town boundary of the town of Port Mansfield is our south fence line. And if we went straight south from our south fence there, our front gate there, to Brownsville, it would be about 43 miles. I mean, as the crow flies, you can't drive there in 43 miles, but I put this up here just so that it kind of reinforces, we've been really interested and concerned about this problem since the flies left Panama, because we figure we're kind of at the front edge of this deal. So I tell you that just so you know we're taking this very seriously, and we've spent a lot of energy thinking about it. You've heard about what USDA is doing and USDA's involvement. And you've also heard a little bit, and I saw Doc Lansford come in a minute ago. Oh, there you are, Doc. And so we've certainly been spending a lot of time together lately. So the Texas Animal Health Commission is the state agency charged with managing animal health in our state for the good of the economy of the state and the industry. And Texas Parks and Wildlife is charged with the management and care and maintenance of the wildlife that we all own, right, as citizens of this state. They're held in the public trust, and that's their responsibility to manage those. And I point that out because these and many other sort of federal and state partners are important in the broad and long-term response to this threat. Without sterile fly production, we can't make screwworms go away again. And candidly, even if they're not in Texas, as long as they're in Mexico, they will be waiting to fly across the river and create the problems. Remember, eradication in the United States officially occurred in the late 60s. But the largest reported infestation year of screwworms was actually in 1975, after eradication had officially occurred. Why? Because if they're next door, all it takes is a favorable winter, a good wet spring, and a wind. And we have infestation in Texas. So these federal and state partners are responsible with our support for the large-scale protection of the industry in the United States, whether that's livestock, agriculture, wildlife. But it's our responsibility as individual operators to take care of our own business. And so it's important for us to be engaged with these larger response plans, but it's equally, if not more important, for us to have a framework, a way for us to individually manage this threat and prepare for it. And so as we started really thinking about that, what are we going to do? Not how are we going to be engaged with public partners, but what are we going to do as operators? This is kind of what we've come up with. And so we're going to kind of walk through this because at first it seems like, man, this is a really bad deal and we sure don't want it to happen. That's still true. Put a check mark by that. It's a bad deal. We don't want it to happen. But we're not powerless. There are things we can do, and preparation is a key part of that. If I can make that go away, I will. Oh, it's not showing up for y'all. Excellent. So let's think about what this could look like. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this risk assessment framework, and just bear with me for a minute because hopefully this helps put the pieces together, has helped us organize our thinking and start to come up with strategies to respond. So there's some key pieces of this we're going to talk through, and the first one is hazard identification. Now this happens to be an easy one in this case because we know what the hazard is, right? It's the screwworms. So we don't need to worry about that anymore. We've already identified the hazard. The next thing, though, that we need to think about is what's the likelihood that they're here? And a good way for me to think or help us think together about what exposure risk means is this. If I get real quiet for a second, I'm going to cover up the microphone. Can anybody hear a fly flying around? I don't hear one either. So that means right now in the room, we don't think we have an exposure risk to screwworm flies, right? But if a fly flew through the door and started flying around in here, heaven forbid, right? But if so, we could hear him flying around maybe, you know, and at that point, we're exposed. So our exposure risk went from 0 to 100%, just like that when the fly flew into the room. So that's what exposure risk means. How likely is it that the flies are here? The second piece of this, though, is attack rate. Because if that fly is flying around the room here, does it necessarily mean that he landed on me and laid eggs in my eye? Or she, I suppose, be more proper there, wouldn't it? I'm not a wildlife biologist like Neil, so I keep that straight. But if that fly was to lay eggs in my eye, I got attacked, but maybe it didn't. So what's the likelihood or the risk that that fly actually lays the eggs and they hatch, right? That's the attack rate or the attack risk. And then, of course, if that happened, fly came in the room, I'm exposed, landed on my eye and laid eggs in my eye, I got attacked. Well, maybe I just rubbed my eye and got rid of them and nothing, no consequence, right? Or maybe they hatched and some bad stuff happened after that. So let's call that the likelihood of a consequential outcome. Either something happened or something didn't. And if I think about that outcome, that consequential outcome, what's the impact or the consequence itself? And it's easier for us to express that in dollars. So now I'm going to walk through this really fast, right? Let's say that the flies showed up at the ranch. A calf was born, right? Happened to be born near where that fly was. The fly laid eggs on that calf's navel. They hatched, became larvae, infested the calf. And the consequence of that is pretty likely a mortality. That calf probably perishes. Okay, right now, that calf is worth a fair amount of money. So I'm going to assign a dollar value to that calf, right? And if I take all of those numbers and multiply them together, my exposure risk, the attack risk, the consequential outcome rate, and the cost of that outcome, I can figure out sort of what this costs me if I don't do anything. But once I know that, I can start thinking about things that I could do. They might cost me something. Is it worth doing them? And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. I like to show this slide here, and I know it's hard to read. That's okay. You don't actually have to read it. This is me just showing you all of those pieces, kind of how we've laid them out in a spreadsheet. I actually have a spreadsheet, and we calculate these things. The first one's exposure risk, and I'm just going to give us a little glimpse here. So I'm going to ask this question, right? Remember, this is the fly in the room with us part. Is there anything that I can do about that? Not so much, right? The best thing I can do is rely on our state and federal agency partners and their companions in Mexico, right, to do their best to hold the line and not have the flies get any closer, and should they get here, to act aggressively to eradicate them as fast as possible. I can't do much about those things. That's the things that would need to be done, right? What we can do is try to predict where we think we are today. In other words, what's the likelihood that there's a fly at our ranch headquarters today? And so we like to make graphs, so I made a graph. And this graph is based on how far away the last known exposure or the last known case of screwworms was in Mexico. And what you see there is that red line is distance. So as the distance gets smaller, what happens to the likelihood that there's a fly at the ranch? Well, it starts getting bigger pretty fast, and that kind of makes sense. But putting a graph like this together for us says, okay, today, if today is day 0, what's the likelihood that there's a fly at the ranch? Based on where we know they last appeared, well, it's actually pretty low. If we project that out 6 months, though, what's the likelihood that we could have a fly in 6 months? It's pretty high. What this tells us is that it's worth it to be prepared. Oh, sorry. These are just some different graphs. This is the graph I made right after they reported that case at Sabines Hidalgo. 70 miles away, right? What happens to our exposure risk? Gets a lot higher, a lot faster. Turns out, though, from our best information available and through Texas Animal Health Commission, that case was an infested animal with larvae, not flies. That animal was observed, right, on inspection, was treated, the case resolved, and there's no indication that any of those larvae hatched and became new flies. That means we don't think there's actually flies in Nuevo Leon. We think the flies are still 300 miles away. So for a day or two, though, we thought our risk looked like this, and now we think it's back to this one. Okay, So we monitor that. Every time there's a report, we update that because we want to know, when do we start taking the next actions? If we want to manage attack rate, so this is if there's flies around, what could we do to try to minimize the number of flies that actually lay eggs in an animal? Because if they don't do that, nothing bad happens, right? So what can we do to manage that? And again, we're going to use history as the prologue here. And so we took the data, the seasonal outbreak data from Texas from 1962 to 1982. And when we looked at that data by season, what we see is that there's somewhere between an 80 and 100% reduction in flies from spring to winter, right? The difference between spring and winter. And that makes sense, right? This is a tropical insect, doesn't really like cold weather very much, and the cooler it is, the less active they are. And so thinking about just that, right, then that gives us some insights about some things we can do. If the weather can help us, right, or at least reduce the attack rate because there's fewer flies, then we can use weather patterns at our ranch. And I know this is a busy chart, but just bear with me. The underlying, like the bars that you see is rainfall, and the lines that you see there are temperatures. And this is actually weather data from our ranch at Port Mansfield. So this is our own data. And the dashed lines you see are sort of the temperature ranges where the screwworm likes to be or doesn't like to be. So if it's way too hot, they don't do very well. If it's cool, they don't do too well. And by taking this, we can come up with parts of the year where we think our attack rate risk is going to be lower, and parts of the year where it's higher. And so what we start doing is planning to change our production a little bit if we need to. And so we think the riskiest animal is a newborn calf. And so we will try our best to move calving seasons into the green circles and keep them out of the yellow and red circles. Right now, we have a cow herd that we have a spring calving and fall calving cow herd. And if our risk increases to a point when we know flies are present, then we will move the spring calvers back toward the winter, and we'll delay the fall calvers into the winter. And we might end up with just one calving season after that, right? If you back up spring calves, calvers far enough and push fall calvers forward enough, then they become one cow herd again. And we will be okay with that if we need to do it. I will tell you that there's a reason that we have both calving seasons. There's a financial reason for it. It's to our advantage to do that. And we know that giving up fall calving cows, if we had the same number of total cows and we made them all spring calvers, one calving season, right now would cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of about $143 a cow. I mean, that's sort of the advantage we get from having two seasons. And that's unique to us. Everybody's situation is different. But because we know that, right, I'm going to have to make a decision, right? When does it become worth it for me to sort of absorb that additional cost? When our exposure risk is zero, is it worth it for us to make that change yet? Probably not. But there is a number, right? There is a number, a point in time where it becomes worth it. And we might even consider some more dramatic changes to the enterprise. Maybe we want to minimize the number of cows that we do have calving. We're going to have a cow herd that calves in the winter. But because of how our forage grows and some things like that, we want to minimize risk on them. And maybe we cut our total cow inventory, but we can't let the ranch sit empty. And so we might then run more yearlings instead of cows as a way to counterbalance our risk. The other thing that we think about quite a bit as part of this, and I think you've seen these other things down at the bottom here. I've mentioned these couple of husbandry issues. One that's much more immediate that we've already made some modest changes to is that probably if you have livestock, even if you have companion animals or horses, you probably already participate in some sort of parasite control program, right? You treat cattle with a pour-on or an injectable dewormer, but that dewormer's for more than just worms. And so as you think about your parasite control program, can we do things today that increase the likelihood that we have animals that are a little more resistant or resilient to that attack rate? In other words, can we reduce the risk by how we start managing now? We all have parasite control programs. Are there things we could do to enhance them? One of the things that we caused us to do is think about, what we're doing, the timing of doing it. Do we do it frequently enough or not frequently enough? And what things might we change? Is it time to update your plan? And part of that plan for us involves our beef quality assurance plan. And if you're involved in the cattle business and maybe you're part of beef quality assurance or have taken the test or something like that to be certified, if you have, you actually have an advantage, and it's this VCPR part. That's vet client patient relationship. Do you have one? I mean, I'll be honest with you, if you're not sure, then you probably don't, okay? But here's the great thing is it's not a hard thing to do. One, if you're not already part of beef quality assurance, I'd encourage you to look into that. It doesn't cost you anything, takes a little bit of time to get your ducks in a row. And one of the components of your BQA plan is the establishment of a vet-client-patient relationship. That's making contact with a veterinarian in your area that can become familiar with your operation and make recommendations to you about your herd health. If you do that, you have a vet-client-patient relationship. That's going to become a little more important here in a minute. So as we think about ways that we might manage our current parasite control programs or make some changes to them, there's some opportunity there. There's also some barriers. And the thing I want to emphasize is that we don't want to do anything that turns an animal health problem into a food safety problem. See, the thing is, the screwworm is not a food problem, right? It's not like you're going to go to the grocery store, or somebody's going to go to the grocery store and unwrap a steak that's got screwworm larvae in it, right? That's not going to happen. I mean, that'd be terrible if it did, but it's not going to. So how could we turn this animal health problem into a food safety problem? If too many people make unwise choices and put products and perform practices on cattle that create residue problems that do make it a food safety problem, and the loss of our market confidence could be as impactful as screwworm infestation, right? So this is an important issue, and we've thought quite a bit about it. We'll talk a little more about that in a second. Now, I've already talked about this consequential outcome rate, and so before I was talking about attack rate, all those things, changing our husbandry practices, changing timing of calving, finding products in our parasite control program, or giving ourselves an advantage through things like that, that's all to manage attack rate. What if an animal actually does, though, get screwworms? Or is there anything we can do to manage the outcome? Because we know if we don't do anything, the outcome is probably pretty bad. But there are things we can do, and the biggest part of those things is paying more attention. We know this is a treatable problem. Neil mentioned, in the 50s and 60s, I grew up hearing stories about it, right? That occupied a lot of effort and energy for a lot of people. But the reason they did that is because if you catch it, you can treat it, and the animals recover, right? So you took that consequential outcome rate, death loss, right, from really high to really low, and that's worth it. And so what are the biggest thing that we know that we can do there is better monitoring, because I can't treat an animal that I don't know has a problem, and I won't know they have a problem unless we put eyeballs on them a little more frequently than we currently do. And I'll tell you, that's hard for us. We operate on pretty big country, it's pretty brushy, it's hard to see them all. And so we've already started doing some things to try to improve our ability to do that. So I'm going to walk you through a quick example here. I don't know how readable that is. Yeah, that's pretty readable. So I want you to just put your eyeballs on the very top line, the one that's still in white. The first value there is 0%. That's if we think our exposure rate is 0% right now, What's screwworms costing us right now? Zero. Okay, now let's move our eyes down to that first yellow bar, right? If we think exposure rate's 100%, right, and our attack rate's 20%, and we're going to have 25% death loss because we're doing everything we can, it might cost us $75 to do that, right? What if we go down to that first red line? If attack rate goes up to 40%, it costs us $150 a head. Look at this the other direction. If I thought my attack rate was going to be 40%, how much would I be willing to pay to drop it down to 20? Well, $75 per cow on the place. Are there things I can do for $75? Absolutely. Lots of things I can do. And so this is the value, if you will, trying to manage attack rate, thinking about parasite control and therapy, right? How do we prevent it, and what do we do to treat it if we get it? And so we're going to take just a minute and walk through some of that, because this is where people want to talk about products. What products can we use or do we have access to that can help us with these problems? I've already kind of mentioned, I'm going to emphasize again, the first step isn't a product. The first step is thinking about how we manage the operation, the timing of things, and the things that we do that create risk or reduce risk. And then after that, we can start thinking about products to use for prevention or treatment. The products that are important in this thing are regulated by two different federal agencies. The EPA regulates pesticides and FDA regulates animal drugs. The dewormers that we use, if it's an injectable systemic product, it might control external parasites, but because it's systemic in the animal, FDA tends to regulate those. If it's something that you use strictly to kill bugs, it's a pesticide, and EPA regulates those. Okay? I like to use the example, I'm guessing that most of y'all, or some of y'all, probably have a private applicator's license because you treat brush, or you do some sort of a brush control program that has caused you to have an applicator's license, and that means you've read a label on the back of a herbicide, and it says, and those are registered with EPA. And that label somewhere on it says, to effect, thou shalt not use this product in any way not stated on this label, otherwise it's a violation of federal law. So EPA is pretty strict. Now FDA is also pretty strict, but they have some other ways to move around things like emergency use authorization, extra label use, and minor species use. I'm just going to not go through a lot of stuff on here. I just want to re-emphasize, right, that these labels matter and they're important, and adherence to these regulations is actually really important because it's part of how we maintain the integrity of the food supply and maintain consumer confidence. It's also the way to make sure the stuff you do actually does something, right? So that's an important thing as well. Oh, I forgot I put this picture on here, this deer running away, just to remind me to say this, and I forgot automatically. In Texas, if somebody harvests a white-tailed deer, what do they have to do with it? Make sure it gets consumed, right? It's a law. That means that wildlife, game species in particular, are actually food animals because they're going to be consumed. And that means the things that apply to livestock food animals in terms of drug use also apply to wildlife. And so, we need to keep that in mind. The other thing that I want to kind of remind everybody is the notion of pesticide resistance. Everybody familiar with this idea of pesticide resistance? Like, we had some bug spray and we used to use it for ants or whatever, and then after a while the ants seemed to like it, you know, and we sprayed a little more of it and the ants got bigger and meaner after a while. Okay, that's this notion of pesticide resistance, and it turns out that flies are really, really good at developing resistance. They're really good at it. That's why if you have a fly control program in your livestock operation today, like maybe you use insecticide ear tags or something like that, you don't use the same ones every year, you switch them. The reason is because if you use them 2 years in a row, the flies on your ranch are now resistant to that pesticide and it won't work anymore. The same thing's true even with systemic drugs. Oops. I have a nice chart I'll show you in a minute. And so I want to at least mention this notion of resistance as we start now talking about products. So products that are approved and indicated for New World screwworm, either treatment or control, so think control is prevention, right? In the United States. So USDA has a list out there, and until about 10 days ago, or I guess September 30th technically, so that's more than 10 days ago, there were only 2 products on that list. There's now another product on that list, Dectomax, received a conditional approval through FDA for the control or treatment and control of screwworms for a duration of up to 21 days in beef cattle and in basically non-reproductive dairy cows under a certain age that aren't going to be milked, okay? So think about it like that, but basically in beef cattle. And in fact, last Friday, another product received conditional approval for use in dogs. And this is a product, the trade name is Credelio. Doc, is that like Lotilaner? Do you know? Okay, Lotilaner is the chemical name on that. That, you know, it might be important to you if you have a dog, right? And you're worried about managing that. There are a lot of products, though, that are approved for use in livestock in the United States, but they don't have an indication or a label for screwworms. Now, why would that be? Because we haven't had them in 50 years. So if there's a product that's come to market anytime since kind of, 1980, it probably doesn't have indication for screwworms on it because there were no screwworms to treat in the United States. And so we have to ask ourselves a question, if there's no indication, right, are there still some things that might be helpful or effective? This is where that vet-client-patient relationship comes in, because the best source of information for that question is your veterinarian. The other part of that is if there's a product that could be useful in a way that it's not indicated or labeled for, if it's a drug, your veterinarian has the capacity to prescribe that and help you make that decision. But you have to do that under the direction of a veterinarian. You can't just decide on your own. And the veterinarian can only do that if they have a valid client-patient relationship, hence the importance of establishing that. I'd say establish it now. Why wait until you need it, right? Go ahead and put that number in your cell phone now. So the important part here is not, I'm going to talk about some more products. It's not so you can remember all these different chemicals and stuff. It's really to encourage you to find this information if you need it and know what questions to ask your veterinarian should that come up. So there are some other EPA registered products besides the really the one that's readily available to you, which is permethrin. There are some other compounds in the same classes that are registered with EPA for use in livestock. They just don't say screwworms on them. It's pretty likely that in the short term, there will be some authorizations for some of those products or extensions or expansions of their labels to include indication for screwworm without guarantee that they work. Okay, that's going to be the caveat. And that authorization will come maybe in some different ways. So it could be emergency use. It could be through sort of a registration expansion that could be available. I'm aware that the state of Florida has done some of that recently, and that would sort of set some guidelines to expand the products that are available. They're going to be in these same categories, like organophosphates and pyrethroids primarily. There's some other things that we expect, like those ear tags I mentioned that have those same molecules in them that might also be considerations. We know from the 1970s the use of insecticide ear tags really reduced to zero infestation of screwworms in cattle where they were applied. We don't know, or I'm not able to say that it was because they were so effective against the screwworms themselves, but it cleaned all the ticks out of those cows' ears. And one of the main routes of screwworm infestation was through tick bites. So you got rid of the ticks, you got rid of the screwworm problem in those cows on the Gulf Coast. So think about secondary benefits of some of these parasite control strategies and think about your current program. Okay, this is the one that everybody likes to talk about because for those of us in the industry, these are the products that we're really familiar with. Macrocyclic lactones, and you're like, I'm not familiar with that at all. Never had a shot of that in my life. These are things like ivermectin or Ivomec or Dectomax or Cydectin, Eprinex, long range, those kinds of things are all in this category. None of those things in the United States, with the exception of the one I mentioned that just got a conditional approval a moment ago, Dectomax, have any indication for screwworms because all of them were brought to market in the late 1980s, really mid to late 1980s, the first ones of these. So none of them say screwworms on them, but they are available in other places in the world. And they are used routinely as part of control programs. And that's why I'm showing you this graph. So these three molecules, ivermectin, doramectin, which is Dectomax, and abamectin, which isn't available in an injectable form in the US at all, but they're all in the same family of drugs, have been used in South America since the early 1990s, in part to help control screwworms. Now, when you look at this graph in the early 90s, what do you see about the effectiveness of these drugs? Did they work? 100%. That's pretty good. What happened after that? Did they still work? A little bit, but not as good. And then out here by, the 2020s, it looks like at least a couple of those products' effectiveness has gone, maybe close to zero. Note that red bar that pops back up again in 2025, that's on a triple dose. Okay, so it regained some apparent effectiveness because you use 3 times as much of it. Why am I showing you this? Because of resistance. So resistance is real. It does happen. Now, how did it happen in South America? It happened because they've used the products consistently every 28 days, 8 to 12 months out of the year for 25 years. That's a long time, a lot of use. So we don't know until they get here whether those products will work effectively for us or not, but we want to at least be mindful about how we use them so that we don't cause some other problems. There's a whole category or sets of products that are not currently available in the U.S. They're not sold for any reason in the U.S., but they are in use in other parts of the world where this pest is a problem. And I'm putting some of these up here. I'm not even going to really talk about, I can't pronounce most of these words anyway, but I'm kind of putting them up here because as this threat grows, I really want to kind of give a compliment to how USDA, Animal Health Commission have engaged with FDA and EPA to hasten or create pathways for approval of some products. So should the threat continue to grow, if there were products that were going to be, say, first on the list as new products approved for screwworm use in the U.S., it's almost certainly going to be products that have already been shown to be effective in other parts of the world because they already have some data. And I certainly would anticipate, right, that should this threat continue to grow or emerge in the near future, that those would be the first products on the list. So with that said, a couple of key takeaways here. I appreciate y'all being patient with me as I mutter through this. One, if you don't remember anything else that I've talked to you about this evening, I mean, remember all Neil's stuff because he's real smart. But if you don't remember anything else I've talked about, remember that you're not powerless. There are things we can do. Think about this risk framework. What can we do to manage attack rate? What can we do to manage the consequence rate? In other words, how do we prevent and how do we treat? Can we do things with husbandry? Can we do things with products? Which of those things is most available to you? We're all different. Our situations are all different. What works for us might not fit in your business. But remember that everything you do will have some cost, but that cost may be less than not doing anything, right? And giving yourself a way to compare those helps you make decisions. It helps you plan not to panic. Because the last thing in the world that you want is there's a fly buzzing around, you got big red eyes, and we pull our hair out and run away, right? That for sure isn't going to solve anything. So plan not to panic. And with that, I will wrap myself up. Appreciate y'all's kind attention, and I suppose we'll do questions. And you can ask questions. Y'all are going to be around the room. We'll stay up here close. You're going to help us out?
Sure.
All right.
Here's my phone. And we'll just kind of bounce around a little bit. So if you have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. That way everybody hears that question, because in a room this size, we can't always be effective in that regard. So, yes, ma'am.
Thank you. What's the timeline for getting the new facility up and running down in Mission?
So what we hear is that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is working to design the facility. Once it's designed, construction will likely take somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 to 3 years. We might see screwworm flies coming out of that facility 3 to 3.5 years from now. That's not the news we'd like to hear, but that's the talk on the schedule thus far. Dr. Lansford, do you have any other updates on that? I haven't updated it to like 6 months or anything yet? Okay. That capacity will be in excess of 300 million flies per week. And they're using some new innovations there that might actually effectively double that because they've come up with some technologies to produce only male flies. So when you're rearing flies, you're rearing both the female and the male. But if you're able to only produce the male flies, and you got a 50-50 ratio, you're going to produce twice as many effective flies. So there's some opportunity there.
Sure. I'll throw one out here just because obviously cattle are a tremendous impact on are a big part of our economy. At the same time, we've talked about wildlife, and we also have sheep, goat, swine, but it becomes more challenging on those because we don't have those drugs. You might just touch on, based on that, how producers will react to that.
Sure. That's a really good question, and I know that a lot of what I'm talking about is in the context of cattle because that's the livestock operation that we operate. I would say that you kind of take them in order there, or maybe not in order, but pieces of that. For sheep and goat production, we know, again, let's let history be our guide, that if anything, sheep and goats are going to be more affected than cattle, mainly because of body size, and wool is going to be an issue if you still have wool sheep. But many of the products that we talked about here, how parasite control programs play into that, that there might be a minor species indication available or through your veterinarian in order to address similar problems in sheep and goats as you would in cattle. So the drugs aren't going to be different, the dosage rate may be a little different, and that's something your veterinarian can help you with. For swine, I'd say the same thing. There's one or two things that are specific to swine, but the same types of ideas would apply. And probably with swine, a bigger thing is, particularly in Texas, if we're talking about non-commercial swine, so, we're here at the rodeo, and so for swine projects, one advantage any project type animals would have is that people are putting their hands and their eyes on them multiple times a day. And so in that scenario, I actually think while your exposure risk could be really high, you can manage the consequence really well, right? So any animal that gets a wound, a scratch, anything like that, make sure they get doctored, treated, and treated with a topical fly spray, and you've probably addressed a lot of that. Wildlife, man, the wildlife problem is a tough one. It's a really tough one. The biggest thing with wildlife is, can you observe them enough to know if you have a problem? And that's going to depend a lot on where you're at and exactly how you're set up. Do you have hunters? Do they have trail cameras? Are they paying attention? Take advantage of all those opportunities to increase surveillance or monitoring. You know, I said for us, the first step in trying to treat the problem in cattle is us using our eyeballs to see them more. Are there things we can do today with wildlife that we couldn't have done in 1960? Well, trail cameras are one of those. Treatment-wise, though, boy, I wish I could say that there was this whole suite of options, but there just aren't. You know, it's not even the matter of approvals on products, it's how do you deliver them? How do you actually get them out there where they don't cause more problems than they solve? So I wish I had better wildlife information there, but that's my best.
Well, I think all I was looking for is just, you know, that it is something that we have to think about. But yeah, it's still one of those, there's still a lot of questions that are going to linger.
Excuse me, do you have any opinions on, you know, adding feed stuff for wildlife specifically, like Ivermectin? You hear, you know, feed salesmen, things talking about, you know, adding Ivermectin to a different feed.
Sure, I'll speak to that a little bit. So, you know, we've thought about this question a lot. And of course, in Texas, we feed deer quite a bit. It's, you know, for various purposes. And so automatically we think, hey, is there something we can feed to help address this problem? Unfortunately, even if we look at minor species use and things like that, there's no labeling allowance for the use of those products in animal feed. In fact, statutorily, like the law says that a veterinarian can do all kinds of stuff, extra label, except add drugs to food, animal feed for food animals. And remember I said wildlife count, right? And so that's a big barrier to that. Now that's sort of a regulatory barrier. I'm going to tell you that in all honesty that there's an implementation problem there too, because one, in order for that product to be effective, the animal has to consume an appropriate dose of it. If we're talking about feed through, they have to consume it chronically, like they got to have it, you know, pretty regularly, if not every day, at least every other day or two. How do we know? And the amount we need to get in the animal then depends on how much feed they eat, and I have no idea how much feed they eat. I can measure how much feed disappears out of the deer feeder maybe, but I mean, any of y'all ever have hogs eat feed out of a deer feeder? So we don't really know, right, how much they're going to consume. We don't have, therefore, a way to mix the product appropriately, and we just don't have an efficient way to deliver it that doesn't cause perhaps worse problems later on. And so again, I'm a nutritionist. Like, I like to mix stuff and feed it. That's, you know, one of my favorite things to do. Unfortunately, right now, I don't see that as a viable option for wildlife. Will that change? Is there some new technology, something that could come up? Sure, you know, be optimistic, but currently I just don't. I would say this is my opinion, but it's a pretty strongly held opinion. I'd say that that's just not feasible right now.
Jason, thank you a lot for that cost analysis, because that's something we really take home to and look at. But Neil, let me ask this question. In the conversations or whatever you've heard regarding the containment and surveillance zones, let's take whether it's the IZ, the AZ, or even the FSA, I'm assuming those are movement restrictions when those zones are established if there's a discovery?
From what I understand, and we might defer to Dr. Lansford on this if I get it wrong, from what I understand, the only movement restrictions would be in the infested zone, which would be the IZ, which is at least a 20-kilometer radius around there, so that 310,000 acres plus a little bit to shore up on landscape cues. That would be the only place where there would be immediate movement restrictions for containment that would require inspection before those animals that are from that area could be shipped. Did I get that close? That's it. Okay.
On the other zones, do you think then there is a spray and treat or something like we do for ticks? Or has there been any discussion on, if we're not movement stopped, are we able to treat and move?
So those other zones become surveillance zones and potentially areas that sterile screwworms flies would be distributed in. So that next zone out would be a candidate for that. So there'd be surveillance in that zone. So there'd be mandatory surveillance, and that zone would have to be clean of any detections of New World screwworms before that infested zone could be then released. And so there's a procedure that they go through for the release of that infested zone.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, I might add on, the way I understood your question was, will there be a protocol for inspection, treatment, and movement out of the quarantine zone? Is that right? And so I think if anybody is familiar with the fever tick program, I mean, we don't know with certainty. I know Animal Health Commission's been working diligently on those plans and negotiating that with USDA a little bit as this playbook's come out and stuff. And so we're all kind of anxiously awaiting, the determinations on specifics. But I'll say this in my opinion. I keep looking back there at Dr. Lansford because, I might say something you're going to get mad at me for. But just in case he gets mad at me, I'm sorry in advance. I don't know exactly what it'll be, of course, but I have high certainty that the commitment to continuity of business, which is referenced in the USDA playbook, has been a consistent message from Animal Health Commission, is that the idea will be, even within a control zone, quarantine zone, infested zone, that inspection, treatment as required will generate certification for movement, and doing that as fast as possible is what we would anticipate. So kind of like with fever ticks, if you know you're infested, maybe there's a treat then move order. If you're, in an adjacent zone or something like that, it might be an inspect, treat as necessary, then get certified to move. But we're confident about that. Unlike an infectious disease like shipping fever or something, this isn't something that just because I have it and I'm next to you that you automatically are suspected of having it. So we can probably find animals and pull them out and hold them. Clean animals can go, but that's going to require inspection. So maybe that's a little extra detail on that part.
All right. I knew we'd bait you into this.
You bait me into it. So just a few comments. Good evening, everybody. I'm T.R. Lansford. I'm the Assistant State Veterinarian Deputy Executive Director at Animal Health Commission. So really appreciate all of this information and the opportunity to work with these guys in developing responses and working through these issues. A couple of comments that I think are important for everybody to really get their head wrapped around. Everybody gets a little bit itchy about movement controls and quarantines, right? Absolutely. So to Dr. Wilkins' point, the reason that is so critical is because we've got to protect the rest of the industry in the state. We no longer operate with a local or a regional livestock production system anymore. We have national livestock production systems. You think about the number, this is just an example, the dairy cows that move in and out of the state of Texas, dairy cattle, 40 to 80,000 head a month. Those are day-old calves that are coming in calf rearing facilities and then go out. A year and a half later is springing heifers to go back to the state they came from to enter the milking stream. That is critical to the national milk supply. So that is why we have to do things, and that's just one example, but why we have to do things to control the movement of these animals. Because I'll give the other example that I always use on myself. So I have cattle about 90 miles south of here. If I work cattle on a Saturday evening and have an infested calf that I wing that goes through a sale barn Monday morning, a processing facility in Central Texas Tuesday morning, by Wednesday it can be in Kansas. So that's why we have to be diligent. If we have a screwworm issue and we have to put in movement controls and quarantines, that's why. We've got to protect the rest of the industries in the state. So all of that said, treatment-wise, I know there's been a lot of consternation and frustration with Animal Health Commission about, well, what's the plan, what's the plan? Well, one, because it's a foreign animal disease or pest, and there's trade implications, we have to make sure we're in lockstep with what USDA is doing or planning to do. The other part of that we have not given a bunch of detail on is we're still waiting. We're in the same boat as everybody else. We're still waiting on that list of treatments, right? So it's great. We've got Dectomax CA1. There are some others in the works. We're working with a couple of the companies to prioritize some products to hopefully they can get through the 2E exemption process with EPA through Texas Department of Agriculture in Texas. You mentioned Florida. They did some things with some products recently. We're looking at some products as well to help encourage that process. So that's all being said because there are things coming. And there's some other things also being used in other parts of the world that the companies, the drug companies, are looking at very seriously to get on the list and get approved in the United States as well. And so, again, we haven't put out a lot of detailed information about, well, what is the treatment going to be? Well, it's also going to depend on, are these calves that are weaned calves or stocker cattle that are going to be moving on to a feed yard where withdrawal issues aren't as big an issue? Or is this slaughter animals that are going to leave the ranch and go to slaughter? Well, now we have to worry about residues. So again, all of those things have to be factored into those movements and those treatments and what that looks like. So that's, I know a lot of stuff, but that's kind of where we are.
Do you have the manpower to take care of all of that?
Great question. The short answer is absolutely not. You know,
We're going to be frozen.
No, sir. So here's the deal. And so we are absolutely committed to continuity of operations. We can't lock an operation down because there's screwworms in the area and say you can no longer move animals. That's not. One, there's animal health issues there's animal welfare issues, and there's just continuity of operations and business issues. We can't do that, right? So what we're working on hopefully we don't get here, we're going to throw everything we've got at the first infestation, to include being able to get sterile flies to help with that situation, and we should have those within 48 hours of an infestation when we get a confirmation of that. And we're going to lock everything down with movement controls and inspections to do everything we can to prevent that population from expanding. And hopefully, with the sterile flies in that mix, we can eradicate that small area. Plan B, C, D, E, F, G, etc., as if those areas expand, we've got several response partners already in the works that we're working on training with to be able to do some of those inspection certifications and to get the movement permits done. And we're also working with USDA and AgriLife Extension to do a certified, essentially a certified producer program, so that we force multiply and have folks out in the field that we've trained, that have gone through a vetting process to be able to go out and do those certifications for movement as well. So will it add some time to that because we'll have to do some of those inspections and certify those things and get those permits? Yes, sir. But we're not going to lock anybody down.
So if you have 18% of the state under quarantine, you think you got enough people in this secondary training to be able to move it and not?
Right this minute, no, but we're working on that. Yes, sir.
And you need to be ready for it before you get there.
Right. That's why we're putting all of these things in place now. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
We'll go here where Karen's at, and then we'll come back across.
What is it about this particular fly and its larvae that is so much worse than all the other flies and larvae out there?
Go ahead. We're trying to spare you, man. I'm trying to keep you off the circuit here. So that's a great question. And the long and short of it is this is a blowfly. There's many other species and types of blowflies. They're flying around here all the time. The reason this particular one and its immediate, effectively half-brother, which lives on the other side of the planet, the old world screwworm, they're unique, right? Those are the only two species where their larvae only eat living tissue. So you think about a fly like everybody's gone and, turned up something in the garbage can, right, and there's maggots on it and it's kind of nasty and everything, because those kinds of flies are decomposers. They feed on dead and rotten stuff to help break it down. This fly, its larvae only likes fresh meat. And so they infest and consume the living tissue of warm-blooded animals. And they don't care if it's a cow, a sheep, a goat, or a person. That's what they like. And so that's the problem. And that's what makes them special and unique.
Dr. Lansford, is there any information you can share with us on this talked about E-beam technology that does not require the radiation and the possibility of a facility being built quicker simply because you decrease that biosecurity risk of radioactive materials? Anything you can share with us?
So I'm not the one to speak on this with a lot of information. Texas A&M is. I know that A&M is working on is either received the funding. I believe they've received the approval for the funding. Now, whether or not they've received the funding, that's two different things, right? But they've received the approval for the funding to do some research and develop that procedure. So again, you'd have to talk to A&M, and maybe y'all know something more specific.
I don't work for A&M anymore, so I'll say all kinds of stuff that I think they're doing. But no, I think that's accurate. Probably the biggest thing is there's the E-beam technology, which is kind of a low-intensity radiation. It's used pretty regularly to sterilize things. So like you can put vegetables through it, right, to get rid of bacterial contamination. So that product, there's an E-beam research facility in College Station. They have received at least the notional funding. I mean, the government shut down, so I don't know if the check's in the mail or whatever. The other barrier to doing research to try to develop that technology or a related one using X-ray, like lower energy X-ray technology, to accomplish the same purpose. The limitation on those is, do you have a facility that's guaranteed to contain screwworms? Because remember, we don't yet have screwworm flies in the U.S. If you want to do this research project, guess what you have to have? Screwworm flies, right? So that means you're going to have to bring some in, or at least larvae in, and test them. And if you're going to do that, you better be sure that the garage you're doing it in's got pretty tightly sealed windows. Okay? So A&M's gone through the process. They have what's called a biosafety level 3 containment facility. They've gotten that evaluated and certified so that they can do those projects. And to the best of my awareness, they've received at least sort of a verbal confirmation about the approval of their facility and are making plans to start to expedite research on those questions that you asked. That they can get that done well in advance of when they have to stick the nuclear reactor into the facility and mission, so they'll know the answer and can select the most expeditious technology as it's being constructed.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. It's a great question.
Yeah, so that's definitely been one of the challenges with all of these things related to screwworms, right? We haven't had them in this country for 50 whatever years officially. So that means we didn't have the fly to do research on either, and so there's a question about the feed products, feed-through products, same thing. Is that a bad idea? No. It's just we have zero information. Nobody has that information. And to do the research that we need to get the information, that's all got to be done in Central America or South America where there's screwworms. And so certainly one other comment about A&M is understand that they have put in they have received that approval and they're in the process of getting flies to start that work. So yes.
Awesome. Howdy. Thank y'all very much. Great information. If there's an infestation, who then pays for the continuing inspections and surveillance?
You want to start that?
Who pays for it?
Who pays?
Well, initially, I mean, there's not a definite track record for that, right? And so initially, what's in the response plan from USDA is that they would use certain protocols to figure out if there's going to be compensation to producers, for example. They don't promise that compensation is going to be there. So it has not been allocated, has not been appropriated. So that's a question that's just up in the air as far as who bears the burden, the financial burden. Right now, for us, we're assuming we're going to be in the worst case scenario of bearing the financial burden. If there's a program and an appropriation in the future that gives some compensation for that, obviously we'd take advantage of it. Those programs, looking at the track record of how those are released, are generally something that is not released up front. So those compensation programs are usually done in arrears. So for example, when there was COVID compensation programs that for producers, that was done in arrears, not up front. So,
Yeah, I'll add 2 cents to the nickel there. And to Neil's point, like our response, anything we would do, we anticipate that's on us unless there's some emergency action. The broader surveillance and movement controls and staffing inspectors and things like that is certainly something that's government's responsibility. Like, we don't anticipate as a producer having to send a check to TR or something like that to pay for his time. I mean, we would because we like him a lot, but so I mean, I just want to be clear, like that part, who pays for the sterile flies? Well, we do through our tax dollars, but that's going to be government's responsibility.
Yeah, so the only thing I would add to that discussion is that there are models out there. If we look at the cattle fever tick eradication program, some of the reimbursement programs for treatments through ELAP and some of those funding structures are probably models that will be looked at. Similarly, last year with high-path avian influenza in the dairy cattle in the dairy cow piece, there was a reimbursement on production losses. Again, it's all in arrears. It's based on the factors, whatever those things are that they put out there. So there are some models out there. I have not heard anything beyond just the talk of that. Yeah.
I have a question while we're waiting, if there's somebody else that comes up with one. One of the initial questions that was asked was timeline and, for the Texas facility, and we talked like there might be 3.5 years, something like that. Is the Panama facility, they're essentially the seed stock producer for this facility. Are they ramping up production right now in an effort to just get ready for what we may be seeing?
The facility, the COPEC facility in Panama is at full production right now. Okay. And in fact, there's kind of a barrier for going in there and doing any work there, any research there, anything that would slow down the production, because we can't afford to slow down the production or potentially stop the production for any length of time in Panama when, all we have is those 100 million flies a week. And that's full bore production. They have no capacity to produce anymore. They do not have. That would require a refitting of the facility, and that would mean shutting down the facility for a while, or at least reducing its production while they refit.
Gotcha.
Stay here for you. Neil, appreciate, particularly where you addressed where we had the agencies and the associations conglomerated to help us with a discovery if there is one. But I would ask if there is any information being disseminated to the general population who certainly does not understand this to mitigate the fear factor of don't eat beef. And if there isn't, is that on the schedule to get ahead of a discovery?
That's a great point, Carl. Obviously, that's something that's well needed. We've got to get out in front of that. I think we can fold in groups like the Texas Beef Council, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and those types of organizations that have the talent for public relations programs like that. But we're likely going to need to do that, particularly when we get the first screwworm case. If we get the first screwworm case in the United States, the market's going to, it'll be big news. There'll be assumptions by some consumers that they're eating screwworms in their meat and this type of stuff, and we just have to be really clear. And
I'll give a quick, again, another 2 cents to his nickel on this. And I'm going to speak about sort of the consumer-facing piece of this, to your point, making sure people don't lose their minds and quit going to the grocery store, all become vegetarian or something. We know just from our interaction with some of these other folks that Neil mentioned that they are prepared with that. They've got a plan in place for how they would communicate, but it's a little bit of timing problem. Like, should you start now saying, hey, don't worry, there's no maggots in your steak? It's true, right? It's a good message, but if you start too soon, do you actually cause more damage than you start? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that just through some discussions that we've been fortunate to be a part of, that consideration is there, and that people who are really good at sort of consumer communication, like, more public stuff than what we are used to, do have some plans in place to make sure that people are reassured about the safety of their food.
Yeah, so that hits on the other one of the other biggest challenges associated with any kind of response, whether it's pest or disease, right, is communications, the outreach portion of that, and that's huge. Those are standalone plans. Animal Health Commission has been working with, we have calls every other week, one with state agencies and federal agencies that will respond, and from the communication standpoint, and also with our stakeholders, our industry groups. And so certainly folks like the Beef Council, Texas Beef Council has got some things already put together because we helped craft some of those. Other part of my career I spent in meat inspection, doing regulatory work in meat inspection. So at a national level, FSIS, the Food Safety Inspection Service, who's over meat inspection at the federal level, has put some information out regarding New World screwworms. It essentially says, this is can be a highly localized condition. It can be a pass and trim situation. It just goes through the normal inspection process for veterinary disposition, ultimately to determine is that carcass fit to go on into the food chain or not. So all of those things are out there. In the wings, it's a timing thing, right? So we have to leave it up to those communications experts to figure out when's the right time to put that out.
Just one more question. You said something about the temperature rising. Does that affect how far the fly will go? Like, would the fly end up going all the way up to Canada if it ever was to get into the United States because it doesn't get that hot up there, or is it just fly however it wants to fly?
Sure. No, that's a great question. The little chart I showed was really like, how does temperature affect, the activity of a fly, right, flying around my head or something. And they don't like it too hot or too cold. To your point, if overall, Candidly, I mean, it was hotter this summer than it was in the summer in 1976. I mean, that's a fact. Maybe it'll be cooler next summer, I don't know. But certainly if you think about what the minimum temperatures are, right, does it stay warmer at the lows and not get too hot in the highs, then you could say, well, yeah, where's the areas that the flies could expand to? And Neil showed a graph in his talk that showed sort of, that they moved up into Oklahoma and touched southern Kansas at one point. I think your graph was from 72. Yes. Okay, so that was strictly temperature based. That happened to be a pretty mild winter right before that with a pretty modest summer that allowed them to expand that far north. But it gets cold up there in the winter. So they'll all die off in the winter, move back to South Texas where they can be snowbirds and then start their way back up. So there's not likely to be an overwintering population in the Central Plains or Canada. Although, could it be possible that in a given year with the given, set of circumstances, you could see a big northward bulge, for a season? I think that's entirely possible should Texas become sort of perpetually infested. Did I get at your question, you think? Okay.
Okay, any other questions? Well, thank you for asking the questions. That's how we all learn. That's the way we've set these types of things up. And so again, just want to show our appreciation to Dr. Wilkins, Dr. Sawyer, Dr. Lansford for being here. And then I'm going to turn the mic over to Mr. Evans here to let him make some closing comments.
I appreciate everybody being here. I wanted to remind you, if you haven't voted for Proposition A and B, I think the polls might be closed, but I would suggest you do it tonight if you can. Do not put it off. If you enjoy facilities and things like we've done today, once we have the approval for that, we expect and have plans to expand this rodeo, not a rodeo necessarily, but to 8 months out of the year operating with bringing you value like we did tonight. And we would look forward to continuing to do some exciting things. So please vote for Proposition A, and we support B, so that this city can continue to be an outstanding city in the United States. We appreciate you being here. Thank you very much.